Bonjour à toutes et à tous, je suis Cécile Lombardie et vous écoutez Perspective, le podcast qui explore le médium photographique dans toute sa diversité. À chaque épisode, sa rencontre et avec elle, une nouvelle réflexion sur la photographie, ses esthétiques, ses sémantiques et la façon dont elle impacte notre rapport au réel et modèle nos sociétés. Comme je vous l'annonçais dans l'épisode bonus et celui de la semaine dernière consacré à ma discussion avec les directrices du salon Approche, je rencontre aujourd'hui par écran interposé Jasper Bode, fondateur de la Gallery, située à Amsterdam, et l'artiste anglais Patrick Waterhouse. C'est un plaisir de les recevoir sur ce podcast en tant que premier duo galleriste-artiste pour un épisode en anglais où nous discuterons de leur trajectoire personnelle, de leur conception de la photographie et du projet Restricted Images, qui est la proposition qui sera présentée dans le cadre du salon Approche, qui, je le rappelle, est reporté à début 2021. Maintenant que les présentations sont faites, let's switch to English. As I was saying to my French audience, it's a real pleasure to welcome Jasper Bode, founder of the Gallery in Amsterdam, and Patrick Waterhouse, English artist. My name is Cécile Lombardie, and I host Perspective, a podcast dedicated to the exploration of the photographic medium, its different aesthetics and semantics through interviews with various actors of the photographic ecosystem. This is the second episode of a special cycle on my podcast devoted to the Salon Approche. Hello to both of you.
Hi. Hello.
You are part of the selection for the fourth edition of Approche, dedicated to unique pieces. Today, we are going to talk about your own personal conception of the photographic medium, as well as your background as an artist and a gallerist, and the collection you will be showing at Approche in 2021 called Restricted Images. First, I'd like to ask you to present yourself, starting with you, Patrick. Can you tell us a bit about your personal journey?
So I'm a British artist who I've spent most of the last, 15 years outside of the UK, living in Italy and South Africa, where I also worked and lived for many years, where I produced another body of work called Ponte City with another artist who I collaborate with, Mikhail Sobotsky. And then over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been working in Australia, mainly in the Western Desert with the Warlpiri people, who are an indigenous group who live in Central Australia. I work with photography. I don't really specifically see myself as a photographer because lots of the work that I do is based on a conceptual process as well, which has a bit of a, I suppose, social practice aspect to it, where I'm interested in actually, how the photographic process relates to the subject and the photographer, and actually looking at ways of playing and breaking down those kind of boundaries. I've also, I suppose, had different roles. I was the editor-in-chief of Colors magazine for a few years, which was something I was doing alongside my own practice, although that was all consuming at the time. I think that's me.
Thank you very much. Jasper, you founded the Gallery in 2012. Can you tell us about your background and the bias of your institution?
Okay, well, I think I started off doing art school, and from art school, I never finished it. I became an agent for photographers, or like more art photographers. So we started producing art projects starting here in Holland, and it sort of grew. Then I sort of became a commercial agent, but always with a fascination for the arts. And one day, me and my founding partner, Narda van het Veer, we decided, wouldn't it be amazing if we started our own gallery? And so we did that 12 years ago, and here we are.
Your gallery is described as a gallery that shows inquisitive and provocative contemporary photography. What does it mean exactly?
I think each gallery has their own fascination for the art or art form, and we come from photography, so we like anything to do with photography, but more like the conceptual side of photography. I think we have a very specific group of people. So I don't see like any documentary photography on our walls. It's a completely different game within this field, and so that's why I think we have a very specific group of artists that we represent.
Our audience may not have a precise idea of what the relationship between a gallerist and an artist is like.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us how you met and how you nurture your collaboration over time?
Of course, we knew the Patrick's work that he did with Michael Subotsky, the Ponticity series. Then we had a friend who actually told us about Patrick, and we were like, of course, very interested to meet Patrick. And we all were in Arles for the photo festival, and we had a super nice afternoon together, and that's when we started the collaboration.
And when was this?
When was this, Patrick? Like 2 years ago?
That was, I guess, yes. I mean, God, it's before we entered the apocalypse, which feels like it all feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah, no, I think 2 years.
Yes, and then you guys came to London and came to my studio, and actually, saw some of the physical work, and that really kind of from there began the whole collaboration.
Patrick, you said a few minutes ago that you don't necessarily consider yourself as a photographer, but in your opinion, what does photography allow us to do in comparison to other media? What led you specifically to photography?
I suppose I had always played with photography. I think I am kind of a classic case of someone who did very badly at school, and it means that you end up doing art. If you the two things, if you were a complete kind of academic failure, you could do it was either hairdressing or art. So I didn't have any academic qualifications, and I ended up doing a BTEC in which is like the alternative to A levels in the UK for qualifications in image making. And I mean, I actually did my first work experience in a photography studio in a dark room, doing the very kind of what is now an archaic practice. But I suppose to your question of what is photography, I think it's shifted and become a much more elastic term. I mean, I think the amazing thing about photography is the threshold of entry is so low, and ever lower, in the sense that almost everything we have has a camera now. So it's this kind of most immediate form of image making at its kind of most rudimentary level, but then once you kind of go beyond that, I think in today's world, it's becoming very difficult to define, because, and particularly within the kind of the space and, the contemporary photography exists in, which is always about kind of, shifting that boundary. And I think sometimes, people actually maybe kind of almost lose themselves in this kind of meta analysis, and actually, it can become kind of a bit meaningless.
Before Patrick tells us a bit more about Restricted Images, which is the collection you will be displaying at Approche, Jasper, could you introduce it to us? What is this project about?
As Patrick said, he spent 5 years, right, Patrick?
And yeah, I mean, it was 6 years. Yeah,
6 years with the Warlpiris in Central Australia, and what we really loved about the work is the fact that we're looking at photographs, but each photograph has been worked on by a local artist. They restricted the images on the print itself. So this resulted in a series of unique, beautiful prints. Just our love for the work itself was already really big, and the story behind it is even bigger. So yeah, for us, this was a no-brainer.
Patrick, what gave you the impulse to start this project? How did you come up with the idea to work with those communities and restrict their images in a very unique way?
I had been interested for many years in, I suppose, contested historical narratives. I was when I was actually living in South Africa. I was, and even prior to that, I was always kind of looking for, I suppose, moments that we have kind of a dominant historical understanding that then is challenged by a counter narrative. So I was actually looking at, I suppose, a lot of these histories in terms of colonial expansion, really, and places which, have a history which is rooted in, European empires, and then that history gets broken off and becomes a localized history, as in the case of these nations as they kind of form their own identity. And then a few years later, I suppose, while I had these thoughts in my mind, I was doing an issue of Colors. At the time, I was the creative director, and I got the opportunity through that to go to Central Australia and travel through the Western Desert with some elders and community members. And it was during that time that I kind of was exposed to, this very rich culture and tradition, and also was, fascinated by the fact that, there's a kind of a historical whitewash, in a sense, within Britain, that we don't talk about our colonial history. We learn all about the First and Second World War, but we don't learn about, our own part in kind of large, very consequential histories in the world. And I think it's because there is a cultural cringe that on actually agreement on how to tell the story. It's very easy to come to a consensus of how to talk about the Nazis. So basically people go there, but they don't have the more difficult conversation of, actually the complex interplay of colonial history. So because it's so thorny, there's this kind of ostrich approach to history. So I initially was looking at maps, in actual fact. So I was taking aspects of the historical record that I started collecting after this trip, that I wanted to acquire, artifacts that you would normally find in a private collection or a museum, and then take them to indigenous communities, which normally are not part of those narratives that are displayed in the museums, and have an intervention done through our process of us discussing these maps and putting on place names that were missing and kind of, I suppose, missing information, and then putting them back into the historical record. So that was the kind of the initial idea that I actually had in 2011. So that's really when, I suppose, the very beginning of this project was. And then since 2011, I was collecting different aspects of the historical record, and then in 2000, and I'm so bad with years and dates, and in 2014 or 15, 14, I think. Yeah, it was 2014. I went back, and I actually did two trips. I did one which was just going to archives and libraries and trying to dig around, the historical record. Then I did a subsequent trip going to visit different communities, which is when I first went to Warlpiri country, and to give some kind of sense of the scale of, Warlpiri country, is that you could fit all of the United Kingdom inside Warlpiri country. So it's a landmass which is substantial. And I went to a community called Yundamu, which is a community of approximately 900 community members. And that's when I first went to an art center called Wallakalangu Art Center. And there was just a very, good vibe there. There was kind of intrigue, and I did some initial tests with, some of the local artists and community members about discussing the idea, and that's really was the beginning of working there.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I read in one of your interviews that Aboriginal life was first documented in a book called The Native Tribes of Central Australia, It was written by Francis James Gillen and Walter Baldwin Spencer and first published in 1899. And at that time, both the authors and wider society were very oblivious to the invasion of privacy these images inflicted upon Australia's Aboriginal communities. The pictures revealed the gap in knowledge between the authors, whose goal was showing the exotic natives, and the subjects who were completely unaware of the new medium and how it could reveal their secrets to a wider audience. Since then, photography within these communities is limited, and the majority of photographs taken are restricted in order to protect cultural sensitivity. Patrick, can you tell us a bit more about the attitude of Warlpiri communities towards their own image and representation?
Well, I think there's kind of two aspects to that. One, I think, is the historical context that you've alluded to, and then kind of the present day situation, which is shifting and changing, and this work is kind of, engagement is, I suppose, pays tribute to that reality, because obviously, the moment that Spencer and Gillen were in Central Australia, so there had been obviously interactions across the continent prior to then, and conflicts and the whole complicated and deeply troubling history of settlers. To take the question from another angle and just expand on what you said, Spencer and Gillen are these complicated figures because on the one hand, they were pioneers in many respects in the field of anthropology and ethnography. The term fieldwork was coined from their work, which is really one of the foundational pillars of anthropology and I suppose lots of documentation that we know today, which is where you go and live with the people that you're working with. They learn the language. They were very deeply involved within the community life, but also there was a power dynamic and the deeply problematic, aspects of all of that work as well, and particularly, viewed from today's vantage point. And they transgressed many of the taboos, which the people they were taking pictures of didn't know how the implications of what they were allowing. Today, I think there's a lot more awareness. I was very mindful that I wanted to be respectful, but I, actually was very surprised. Lots of the, it was kind of the opposite. That lots of the people I was working with and take their pictures would completely understandably want copies of the pictures. And something that I've always done when I've worked with people is given them prints, as we're kind of working together. I suppose I have I think a lot of my work is in different forms, is collaborative. And, this is explicitly within the making of the, images. There's kind of an overt process, but I suppose I'm a believer in the fact that, particularly photography, has an interplay with another person. There's always a collaboration there, and I think that's often kind of overlooked with the kind of mythologizing of the kind of heroic photographer. And actually, the thing which is often said to a documentary, photographer by someone, that you're taking something, has a truth to it. Like the way somebody is, carries themselves, their story, their look has, is part of what makes that image. So there's always this kind of interplay and collaboration within image making. I've kind of gone on a bit of a tangent there, but I suppose it's related.
Yeah, and we didn't even explain what your pieces look like. So you gave the power to local artists to restrict their own images using dot painting. How was it perceived for them to be able to actually take action in an inclusive community project? You said a few minutes ago the importance of the concept of collaboration in your work. How was it important to them, and how did it affect your own vision, artistic vision as well?
So just to give some kind of, I suppose, a broad kind of overview, I had originally gone to Yundamu and Nirapi with this kind of archive, this kind of eclectic archive of different aspects of the historical record that related to different knowledge systems. So looking at the way Europeans had depicted land through cartography, looking at astrological charts and kind of the ways in which that was used for navigation, flora and fauna depiction. So all of these things that were kind of categorized by Europeans that also had an indigenous knowledge system around. So I wanted to kind of put them in, take these documents and this archive and put it through this process of revision. So that was really the beginning of the process. And within that were historical photographs. And as you kind of read out in that extract, this term restricted images is often used within institutions to limit access to sensitive material. So it was a real surprise to me because you're going through archives and then you just have like a black box, or you have something that just says restricted image. So that's where the name came from. And I thought, instead of them using the institutional gatekeeper, it would be interesting to use the person and the community depicted as the people who have agency and decide how that works. And I suppose it was a commentary as well on, there's a kind of a playful element to that as well, because I think that whenever we kind of restrict something, we have to be aware that also we are in some ways, making it invisible. We always think about the right to be seen, but also there's the right not to be seen. So there's this kind of interesting kind of complexity to that. And then while I was working on these historical images, I was also taking photographs in the community, and I kind of realized probably a year into the work that lots of contemporary photography is informed by particularly the kind of, ethnographic, anthropological photography, that existed in the past. And I kind of decided that I wanted to put the pictures I was taking there through the same process. So then I went back to my studio and making these prints as if they were going straight to an exhibition. And instead of going to an exhibition, I flew back to Australia and took them back to the desert for us to then do an intervention into those images, which was done through this, traditional mode of dot paintings. And the paintings themselves, have a very rich history. They often depict something which is called a jukapa, or a dreaming, which relates to a story that relates to a particular kinship group or particular person. So, often the painting itself has specific resonance to the person, in the same way that it did with the depiction of the land and the person. So there's this kind of other layer to it. So, yeah.
So you spent more than 5 years living and working with Warlpiri communities. Would you have one or maybe two memories of decisive moments during your creative process in Australia?
I mean, one thing that I always think is an interesting moment when you're working, with people. I can think of this happening in other times in other places, but it kind of struck me was that basically, you're working, in a community, and people are trying to learn who you are, and you're trying to get to know people. And then as the process unfolds, there's a kind of a desire for other people to want to get involved, basically. And there was this particular moment when, instead of me, heading out to try and meet people, I was approached by an elder who's actually also chairman of the art center, who is a great artist, and also, someone who has a lot of stature within the community. And he took me to a very specific place a few hundred kilometers away. So we did this very long drive, and he took me to a place that was very important to him. And we took a series of pictures there. And that was like this shift, I suppose, in a dynamic where you're almost being directed by the person. And I think that often happens when people fall into, even within the documentary practice, people, while they're being watched, fall into a performative role. And then there starts being this kind of exchange that happens, which is always a very nice moment, and where you can feel like it's being channeled by the person that you're photographing.
And do you feel like this collection is complete, or do you plan to eventually go back and create new pieces?
I mean, I feel like lots of the work that I do, it's the same with Ponte as well, and definitely true of this, that you could spend the rest of your life just doing that project. Like, they, in some ways, the line that you draw is an arbitrary one. I mean, you could really carry on and on, but you have to get to some point of actually, shifting and beginning the process of putting it out into the world. And I suppose the space that I am most comfortable in is always in the making of the work, opposed to the kind of navigating the mode of actually putting it out into the world. So I have to be careful. I mean, often I think the reason why the projects I do last for so many years is because you never feel like they're complete, and there's always another way that you could approach it, or a way that it could expand. I mean, though, I suppose I would have been there this year. The plan was to actually have to do an exhibition that would be curated by the community as well. But obviously, that has not been possible, because of the world that we're living in.
You talked about the Ponte City series that you published so in 2008, I believe. It became well known in the photography world, and it also has this collaborative approach in its core. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, it was also done over many years, and is a collaboration between myself and another artist called Mikhail Sabotsky. We met on a residency in a place called Fabrica in Italy. We started collaborating there, and initially Ponte was like part of a much wider project. It was going to be one of the places we were going to, looking at kind of South Africa and, I suppose, different spaces and social structures that people live in. And then instead of it being kind of one part, it became a whole world. And often I think projects are much more powerful for going deep into one place and building up relationships there, than kind of having a kind of wider perspective. And that was definitely the case in this. And we were originally interested in looking at this process of gentrification of the building. It's a very iconic building within the Johannesburg skyline. It was finished in 1976, which was the same year as the Soweto uprisings, as a kind of high living, whites only residential structure. And then after the end of apartheid, there was this white flight from the center of Johannesburg, and it became this place that was mythologized, of all these stories around it being a place that, people would say had prostitution rings in the car parks and Nigerian drug lords living in the penthouse apartments. So when there was a plan to basically clean out the building and move out the residents and turn it into kind of luxury apartments again for this new South Africa, we thought it would be meaningful to actually tell the history of that building, both historically, but looking at what people being evicted from the building and the new people moving in. So that was the kind of original arc for it. But in actual fact, the development fell through. So they started to do the development, and it became a kind of another promised shifting of this idea, basically never came to fruition. Which I think, I mean, in the end, it turned out that wasn't what mattered, because once you kind of go so deeply into a place like that, it says so much about lots of other things. It touches on, I think, kind of ideas around modernism and how, utopian structures relate to dystopian structures as well. And just actually the story of migration across the continent, because the Ponty city really is a hub for people from all across Africa entering Johannesburg and, looking for a new life. It's a place of many different stories, and which we took various different approaches to working. One of the things that we did was take a photograph out of every window of the building over many years, and every door and every television. So, you have this outward view, and you also can see an aspect of the room, and it's a circular building. So there's an unfolding and a complete spatial mapping of the space. So you can see how people live in relationship to each other. You can also see the vantage point outside of the window changes through the elevation. So that kind of very typological approach was one aspect of it. There was also a more traditional social documentary element, and a large aspect working with both found archives and archives that we collected from kind of architectural plans and, going through kind of, collections.
Jasper, you've been following Patrick's work for quite some time now. How would you describe his artistic evolution over the years?
Oof, good question. I think his evolution is Ponty City, starting that body of work. I'm now staring at the book. It's quite an amazing story as well as a project. In terms of evolution, I'm super happy that Patrick has been able to find a completely different, can you call it subject or like interest, and go after it in such depth, which resulted in this whole restricted series. We're super sad because when we started with Patrick, we had a whole plan, to roll out the works worldwide and make everybody acquainted to the works. And then COVID happened, so we're sort of now in a weird limbo situation, and I guess we just have to wait until it all sort of subsides and then try again.
That was my last question, because this interview is coming to an end. Apart from Approche, what are your plans for 2021 post-apocalypse, I hope? Is there a project you can tell us about?
I mean, it's to continue and try, and I hope that many of the things that we've planned will hopefully happen in the next year, and despite the fact that it's been very challenging this year, and basically to do anything, it's been working with the gallery has been really great, because it kind of, particularly if, like I said, I'm somebody who it gets very locked into the whole process of making the work. So the actual kind of process of having a collaboration where you're working out actually how to channel it into the world is really important, obviously. But that's been hugely hampered by what we've had to deal with this year. But I think there are a lot of plans for the future, one of which will be also going back to Australia and working in the community. There is actually an exhibition the beginning of next year at Photo 2020, which will be in the centre of Melbourne, which is actually an outdoor exhibition of some of the work. But I mean, I think that obviously it won't have an international audience, because I don't think anybody is going to be flying in February to Australia.
Probably not. Jasper, do you have something to add?
Yeah, well, we're just ready to try our whole plan again. I just think everything is being put on hold, and this work needs to be shown and to the world. So no, we're just planning. We keep our eyes on the ball, and we try to bring it wherever we can.
Well, thank you so much for doing this interview. It was a real pleasure to get to learn about your projects and the Ravestein Gallery.
Thank you, Cécile.
As usual, I'm also thanking our listeners. I hope I didn't lose too many French people over the course of this conversation. Please let me know your thoughts. Subscribe, like, comment this episode. You will find all the information about Patrick Waterhouse and Jasper Bode and the Ravestein Gallery in the description down below. Don't forget to visit the Instagram page of Perspective at perspectivepod.cast. I will see you next week to discover the Galerie Claire Gasteau and the artist Coraline de Chiara. Take care and see you soon.